It was a quiet evening when the knock at the door came. The kind of knock that felt heavier than usual, a deliberate sound that echoed through the stillness of the house. Sarah had been sitting on the couch, sipping her tea and flipping through a magazine, her mind drifting from one thought to the next. The house was empty except for her. Her husband, Mike, had gone out to meet some old friends for dinner, and their daughter, Emma, was spending the night at her grandmother's. For a moment, she thought she imagined it. Then, the knock came again. She stood up, her feet light on the hardwood floors, and made her way to the door. Who could it be at this hour? Maybe a package, or perhaps a delivery that got mixed up. But there was a gnawing feeling in her chest, a sense of unease she couldn't quite shake. She peered through the peephole. There stood Rachel, her neighbor. Sarah's heart sank. What was she doing here? Rachel had always been friendly, the kind of neighbor who dropped off baked goods and helped with small favors. But lately, things had been off. Sarah noticed Rachel's eyes lingering a little too long on Mike when they ran into each other at the mailbox. The casual conversations between them seemed to have more weight, more tension. Sarah had brushed it off, convincing herself she was just being paranoid. But now, here Rachel was, standing at her door, looking more anxious than usual. Sarah opened the door, forcing a smile. "Hey, Rachel. Is everything okay?" Rachel hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. She didn't wait for an invitation, instead, she walked in as though she had every right to be there. "I'm sorry to just show up like this," Rachel began, her voice softer than usual. I need to talk to you. It's important." Sarah's smile faltered. "Of course. What's going on?" Rachel's eyes darted nervously around the room, as though she was checking for something, or someone. "Can we sit down? I don't know how to say this, but I've been carrying this for weeks now, and I just can't keep it to myself anymore." Sarah's curiosity piqued, and a feeling of dread settled in her stomach. What was going on? She motioned toward the living room. "Let's sit." "You're scaring me a little, Rachel." They sat on the couch, an awkward silence filling the space between them. Rachel's hands twisted in her lap, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. She looked like she was about to say something huge, but couldn't find the words. After what felt like an eternity, Rachel spoke, her voice trembling slightly. "I think I'm in love with your husband." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She blinked, sure she hadn't heard her neighbor correctly. The words felt like a slap, raw and shocking. Her mind raced as she tried to comprehend the full weight of what Rachel had just said. "What?" Sarah's voice came out low, barely above a whisper. "What do you mean, Rachel?" Rachel looked down, unable to meet Sarah's eyes. "I didn't want it to happen. It just did. I never meant for it to go this far, but I've had these feelings for a while now." Sarah stared at her in disbelief. The room felt smaller suddenly, suffocating. The air thickened as Sarah tried to process what was happening. Rachel was in love with Mike? Her mind went to 1,000 places at once. How long had this been going on? Had Mike noticed? Was there something more to their interactions than she had realized? "I'm sorry," Rachel continued, her voice breaking. "I didn't want to hurt you. I couldn't keep it inside anymore. I know this is wrong, but I needed to be honest with you." Sarah felt as though the floor had dropped out from beneath her. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Her throat felt tight, her mind in a whirlwind of emotions. The woman sitting in front of her, the neighbor she had considered a friend, had feelings for her husband. It was almost too much to process. Rachel's eyes were now filled with tears. "I never meant for it to go this far. I've tried to stop, but I can't. Every time I see him, it just happens again. And I know it's wrong. I know I should have stayed away. Sarah felt a wave of anger rise in her chest, but it was quickly replaced by confusion and hurt. Was Mike aware of any of this? Did he know how Rachel felt? She thought of their marriage, solid, stable, the foundation of their life. They had their struggles like anyone else, but she trusted Mike. He had never given her a reason not to. And yet, Rachel was sitting here, telling her that she was in love with him. Do you really think that coming to me and telling me this will make everything better? Sarah asked, her voice cold, more controlled than she felt. Do you think that by confessing, you're doing the right thing? Rachel nodded quickly, her eyes wide. I thought if I told you, it would give me peace. And I thought maybe you'd understand, even though I know you're angry. But I can't live with this secret anymore. It's tearing me apart. Sarah felt her emotions simmer, a mixture of anger, betrayal, and confusion. She stood up abruptly, pacing across the room. Rachel's confession had unraveled everything. This wasn't just about her neighbor. It was about trust, and betrayal, and everything she had believed about her marriage suddenly felt fragile. Why are you telling me this now? Sarah asked, stopping in front of Rachel, her voice rising. Why didn't you tell me earlier, before all this started? Why wait until now, when things are so complicated? Rachel's face flushed. I didn't want to hurt you. I was trying to control it, trying to keep my distance. But I couldn't anymore. I'm sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know. The words hit Sarah like a hammer. Her thoughts spiraled out of control. What did Rachel want from her? Was this some twisted form of guilt, or was there something more to it? Was Rachel trying to take something that belonged to her? The betrayal cut deep, sharper than any physical pain. Rachel stood up, her expression pleading. I understand if you don't want to see me again. I just needed to get this off my chest. I should go. Sarah didn't answer. She just stood there, numb. The house felt too quiet now, like a vacuum had sucked the air out of the room. Her mind raced, trying to piece together the situation. Rachel had confessed, but what did it mean? Had Mike known? Was this just the beginning of something worse? Rachel turned to leave, and Sarah didn't stop her. She walked to the door and opened it without a word. Before stepping out, Rachel paused. Please, Sarah. I'm sorry. And then she was gone. Sarah closed the door slowly, her hands shaking as they rested on the doorknob. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the closed door, her mind reeling. Everything she thought she knew about her life, about her marriage, felt uncertain. Was Rachel's confession just a desperate plea for attention? Or was there more to this? As she walked back into the living room, her eyes landed on the empty couch, the space where Mike had sat just a few hours ago. She thought of all the quiet moments they had shared, the laughter, the conversations, the love. Was any of it real? But more than that, why now? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. Mike was home. Her heart pounded as she turned to face him. He was smiling, holding a bag of takeout from their favorite restaurant. But when he saw her face, his expression changed instantly. Sarah? What's wrong? She opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. There was so much she wanted to say, but how could she? How could she tell him that everything felt like it was falling apart? Mike walked toward her, his face filled with concern. What happened? Her hands trembled as she took a deep breath, gathering the strength to face the truth. She didn't know where this would lead, but she had to start somewhere. Mike, she said, her voice quiet, almost shaky. We need to talk. And just like that, everything that had seemed normal was now hanging in the balance. Sarah stood there, her heart racing, knowing that the next words she said could change everything. Would Mike tell her the truth, Or would this moment push them both into a future filled with more questions than answers? The air between Sarah and Mike felt thick, almost suffocating. She could see the concern etched on his face, his brow furrowed as he took in her expression. She stood there, frozen, her breath shallow, the weight of Rachel's confession still hanging in the room like an unbearable fog. Mike dropped the bag of takeout on the counter, his eyes never leaving her. "Sarah, talk to me. What's going on?" She didn't know where to start. Her thoughts were a chaotic swirl, each emotion fighting for dominance. Anger, hurt, confusion. It was all there. But beneath it all, one question echoed louder than the rest: how long had this been going on? She stared at him, searching his face for any sign that he knew what Rachel had told her. But there was nothing, just concern, maybe a bit of confusion, but no guilt. "Not yet, anyway. I don't know how to say this," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "But Rachel came over tonight. She told me something. Something I never expected." Mike's eyes narrowed, his concern deepening. "Rachel? What did she say?" Sarah took a shaky breath. "She said she's in love with you, Mike." The words hit the air with the force of a slap. Mike's face paled. His body went still, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, unbearable and thick. "Wait." Mike began, his voice low. "What? Are you serious?" "I'm not making this up, Mike," Sarah shot back, her voice rising in frustration. "She came here, and she told me, straight to my face, that she's in love with you." Mike took a step back, running his hands through his hair, clearly struggling to process what Sarah had just told him. I don't know what to say. This doesn't make sense." "Doesn't make sense?" Sarah echoed, her voice sharp. "Mike, how long has this been going on? How long has Rachel been feeling this way?" "I swear, I didn't know, Sarah. I had no idea," he replied, shaking his head, but the look in his eyes, was it guilt? Or just disbelief? She couldn't tell. Sarah's heart raced. She wanted to believe him. She did believe him, but there was something nagging at the back of her mind. How could Rachel suddenly drop this bombshell? Had she been hiding these feelings all along? And if Mike didn't know about it, then why had Rachel waited until now to tell her? She took a step back, trying to make sense of everything. She said she couldn't keep it inside anymore, that she'd been carrying this for weeks. "And you know what the worst part is, Mike?" She said that every time she saw you, she just couldn't stop herself. Mike's eyes flickered with confusion and something else, regret, maybe? He walked over to the counter and leaned against it, his hand gripping the edge as though it was the only thing holding him up. "I never did anything to encourage her, Sarah. You know that," he said, his voice thick with frustration. "I've only ever been committed to you." I don't know why she'd say something like that. Maybe she's confused." "Confused?" Sarah repeated, incredulous. "Mike, she's not confused. She came to me, told me she's in love with you, and she expects me to just believe it's nothing? That she doesn't have feelings for you? How long has this been building up, Mike?" Mike's face fell. "I didn't know, Sarah. I swear to you, I didn't know." But Sarah wasn't sure. If Rachel had feelings for Mike all this time, did that mean there were moments she had been hiding it? Was it possible that Mike, in his own way, had unknowingly
encouraged her? The thought gnawed at Sarah, and she couldn't stop the flood of questions from overwhelming her mind. "Do you think it's just some random thing, Mike? That Rachel just woke up one day and decided she's in love with you?" she asked, her voice rising, unable to hide the anger creeping in. "She didn't come here for nothing. She came here because she feels something. And I don't know what that means for us, for our marriage." Mike looked at her, his eyes wide with panic. I don't know what to say, Sarah. I don't know what to do. I didn't ask for this. For a moment, there was a long silence. The tension between them was palpable, and Sarah could almost feel it, like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. Rachel's confession had shaken her to the core, but it wasn't just about Rachel. It was about trust. Did she still trust Mike? She looked at him, trying to read his face, trying to find some sign that he was telling the truth. But all she saw was confusion and a growing sense of helplessness. And fear. Fear that this could be the beginning of the end. I don't know what to believe anymore, Sarah said softly, her voice barely a whisper. I need time, Mike. I need time to think about this. Mike's face crumpled as if her words had cut him deeper than anything Rachel had said. He reached for her hand, but she pulled away, needing space. I understand, he said, his voice raw. I'll give you time. I don't want to lose you, Sarah. Her heart twisted at the sound of his words. She didn't want to lose him either. But things had changed in that moment. Something had shifted, and no matter how much she wanted to deny it, she knew it. The foundation of their relationship had cracked, and she didn't know if it could be fixed. Don't go, Mike, she said, her voice trembling. Please, just, stay here. We need to talk more about this. But he didn't move. He stood there for a moment longer, his gaze intense, as if he were weighing his next words carefully. I can't fix this right now, Sarah. I need to give you space. I need to think too. I'm not going anywhere. But I can't pretend everything is fine when it's not. With that, he turned and left, heading for the bedroom. Sarah stood there in the middle of the living room, her chest heavy with emotions she didn't know how to handle. She heard the bedroom door close softly behind him. The silence felt deafening. Hours later. Sarah couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned in the bed, her thoughts a storm of chaos. Rachel's words kept repeating in her mind. I'm in love with your husband. She thought of Mike's face when he'd heard the confession, his look of shock and disbelief. Was it genuine? Or was he hiding something? The clock on the nightstand ticked loudly in the quiet room. It was well past midnight, but sleep had evaded her. She pulled herself out of bed and walked to the living room, needing to clear her mind. As she entered the room, her gaze fell
on her phone sitting on the coffee table. She picked it up instinctively, then hesitated. She could call Rachel. Confront her again, demand the truth. But would it make a difference? Would it change anything? Before she could put the phone down, the screen flashed with a new message notification. It's Mike. Don't worry, I'll never let you down. We'll figure this out together. Mike. For a moment, Sarah just stared at the words. Could she believe him? Could she trust him? There was a pit in her stomach, and no matter how many times she read the message, it didn't ease the uncertainty. And then, another thought struck her. What if Rachel wasn't the only one with secrets? The realization hit Sarah like a ton of bricks. Could there be more to this than Rachel's confession? What if Mike wasn't the only one hiding something? As Sarah sat there, her mind raced with possibilities. Would the truth of Mike and Rachel's hidden feelings change everything? The following days were a blur for Sarah. The conversation with Mike felt like a distant memory, but the tension between them lingered like a shadow in their home. She could sense the weight of it every time they spoke. Every time they looked at each other. Every time they tried to pretend everything was fine. But nothing felt fine anymore. Mike had been distant. He had kept to himself more, spending hours on his laptop, avoiding her gaze, and speaking only when necessary. His messages were short, his responses curt, and the affectionate gestures that once defined their relationship had completely disappeared. Sarah didn't know what had happened between them. It was as if a door had shut between them, and she couldn't figure out how to open it again. Rachel, on the other hand, had been surprisingly calm. After their initial confrontation, Sarah expected her neighbor to keep pushing, to stir the pot and make everything even worse. But she didn't. Rachel had pulled back, offering Sarah only an apologetic smile whenever they crossed paths, like nothing had happened. It was as if she had given Sarah the space she needed and had accepted whatever consequences might come. But Sarah wasn't convinced. There was something about Rachel's demeanor that didn't sit right with her. It wasn't the apology or the kind words. It was the way Rachel seemed to have no real emotional attachment to what had happened. It was like she had no real guilt. Was that possible? Could someone confess love so freely and then just let it go? Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of dread, as if something was brewing just beneath the surface. She had to know the truth. Not just about Rachel's feelings for Mike, but about everything. It was late afternoon when Sarah decided she couldn't wait any longer. She was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the untouched cup of tea in front of her when the decision came to her. She had to confront Mike again. This time, she wasn't going to leave things open-ended. She needed answers. She needed answers. The door to the bedroom was closed, but she knocked anyway, her heart beating faster as she heard Mike's voice respond from inside. "Come in." She opened the door slowly, standing in the doorway and watching him sit at the edge of the bed. He was scrolling through his phone, looking distracted and disinterested. The sight of him made her blood boil. He was pretending. Pretending that everything was fine when she knew it wasn't. "Mike, we need to talk," she said, her voice firm but controlled. He looked up at her and nodded, his expression guarded. "Okay. What about?" She stepped into the room and shut the door behind her, taking a deep breath. This was it. No more beating around the bush. She had to ask the questions that had been eating at her for days. "I need to know what's going on," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't care if it's uncomfortable, I don't care if it's awkward. But I need the truth, Mike. And I need it now." Mike put down his phone and looked at her, his face hardening. "What are you asking me, Sarah?" She took another step forward, closing the distance between them. "Rachel. What's going on with you and her?" He flinched, his eyes darting away as if he couldn't bear to look her in the eye. "Sarah, I told you. I've been clear. Nothing happened between us." She's confused. "Then why didn't you tell me she was in love with you?" Sarah snapped. "You said you didn't know. But you've known her for years. You couldn't have been that oblivious." Mike looked at the floor, clearly uncomfortable. "I didn't know, Sarah. I really didn't." She took another step closer, her chest tight with frustration. "How could you not know? How could you not sense something? And why did she come to me, Mike? Why now? Why did she choose to tell me this?" Mike's eyes flickered with guilt, but he didn't speak for a moment. He was processing, she could tell. And maybe he was starting to realize the gravity of the situation. "I don't know, okay," he said finally, his voice quieter. "I don't know why she did it, or why it took her so long to tell you. But I swear, I didn't do anything. I didn't encourage her. I never led her on." Sarah crossed her arms over her chest, her gaze intense. "You're telling me the truth, Mike? That there's nothing between you two?" Mike hesitated before answering. "There's nothing between us, Sarah. I promise." For a moment, Sarah just stared at him, unsure whether to believe him. She wanted to. She wanted to believe that he was telling the truth, but something didn't add up. Rachel's confession felt too real, too raw to just brush off as a mistake. And Mike's reaction, his discomfort, his defensiveness, only made her more suspicious. He wasn't acting like someone who had nothing to hide. "Why do I feel like you're holding something back?" Sarah finally asked, her voice small but sharp. Mike froze. His eyes widened, and for a split second, Sarah thought she saw fear in his eyes. Was it possible that there was more to the story? Had he been hiding something from her all along? "I'm not hiding anything," Mike said quickly, standing up and walking toward her. "I swear to you, Sarah, I'm not." But Sarah wasn't sure anymore. She wasn't sure of anything. She could feel the tension between them rising to a breaking point. Everything she thought she knew about their relationship was starting to crumble, and she couldn't stop it. "I need to know the truth, Mike," Sarah said, her voice now trembling with emotion. "I need you to tell me everything. No more lies. No more secrets." Mike stood still for a moment, as though he was considering his next words carefully. "Sarah," he said softly, "I don't know what's going on with Rachel, but I swear to you, there's nothing between us. There never was. Please, just trust me." But Sarah couldn't trust him. Not anymore. The uncertainty was eating away at her, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe Mike was hiding something from her, or maybe Rachel had taken things too far. But whatever it was, Sarah couldn't let it go. "I don't know if I can trust you anymore, Mike," she said quietly, her voice breaking. "I need time." The words felt like a knife twisting in her chest. She didn't want to say them, but she had to. Time. She needed time to think, to process, and to figure out where she stood. Mike's face fell, the pain evident in his eyes. He reached out to touch her arm, but she pulled away. "I'll give you time, Sarah. But please don't shut me out. Don't walk away from me." She shook her head. "I'm not walking away. I need space. I need to think about everything." Without another word, Sarah turned and walked out of the room, leaving Mike standing there, his head in his hands. She didn't know what the future held, but right now, she couldn't bear to be in that room with him any longer. Later that night, Sarah lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Her mind was racing, 1,000 thoughts running through her head. Rachel's confession. Mike's silence. The doubts. The suspicions. Everything was becoming too much to handle. As she tossed and turned, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She reached for it, seeing a message from an unknown number. "I know what's really going on with Mike. Call me when you're ready." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Who was this? What did they know? Who was the person texting her? What did they know about Mike? And could this new revelation change everything? Sarah sat on the edge of her bed, her fingers trembling as she stared at the message on her phone. The unknown number had sent the cryptic text hours ago. "I know what's really going on with Mike. Call me when you're ready." The weight of those words hit her like a freight train. What could this person possibly know about Mike that she didn't? The questions spiraled in her mind, each one more unsettling. Then the last. She couldn't shake the feeling that something much deeper was going on, something she was only beginning to scratch the surface of. But who was this person? And why had they waited until now to reach out? The room felt suffocating, the walls closing in around her. She glanced over at Mike, who was lying on the couch in the living room, his back turned to her. His body language was closed off, distant. He hadn't said much after their conversation earlier. He'd apologized, of course, but his words had felt hollow, empty. Was he truly telling her the truth? Or was he hiding something? The tension in the air was palpable, but Sarah knew she couldn't keep avoiding the issue. The mystery of what was really happening between Mike and Rachel was gnawing at her. She needed to find out more, to dig deeper, even if it meant uncovering things she wasn't ready to face. She picked up her phone and stared at the message once more, her thumb hovering over the screen. There was no going back now. Whatever this person knew, whatever secrets they were holding, Sarah had to find out. She took a deep breath and pressed call. The call. The phone rang once, twice, and then the line clicked. A voice, soft but urgent, answered on the other end. Hello? Sarah's heart raced. Who is this? How do you know about Mike? There was a pause before the voice responded, as if the person on the other end was carefully considering how much to reveal. I can't tell you everything, but I know what's been going on. I know the truth about your husband. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. What truth? What do you know? The voice seemed to hesitate, then spoke in a low, almost conspiratorial tone. I've been watching, Sarah. I've seen the way he's been acting. The way he's been pulling away from you. The way he's been spending time with Rachel. I'm not the only one who's noticed. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What do you mean, spending time with Rachel? Are you telling me they've been seeing each other? How do you know this? The voice responded slowly, carefully, as though the information was heavy. Rachel isn't just some neighbor, Sarah. She's been involved with your husband in ways you can't imagine. It's not just a simple crush. There's more to it. A knot tightened in Sarah's stomach. What are you saying? Are you telling me they've been having an affair? There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Sarah could barely breathe. Her pulse was pounding in her ears, her thoughts scrambling to make sense of everything. Was it possible? Could Mike have been hiding something so significant from her all this time? I can't say much more, the voice finally said, their tone lower now, almost as if they were afraid of being overheard. But if you want to know the truth, you need to meet me. I'll tell you everything, Sarah. Everything you've been asking about. Where? Sarah asked urgently. Where do we meet? The voice gave her a time and place, a small, secluded cafe on the edge of town. It was a place she'd never been before, but it didn't matter. She didn't care about the location. All that mattered was finding out what this person knew. I'll be there, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The cafe. Later that evening, Sarah drove to the cafe, her nerves on edge. She had no idea what she was walking into. Who was this person, and why were they so determined to get her to meet them? She had never felt more uncertain in her life. As she pulled into the parking lot, she saw the cafe, a small, dimly lit establishment with an old-fashioned sign that seemed out of place in the modern world. It had a cozy, intimate atmosphere, but tonight it felt more like a setting for a confrontation than a casual night out. She stepped out of the car, her heels clicking against the pavement, and walked inside. The warmth of the cafe immediately enveloped her, but the air felt thick with tension. Sarah scanned the room, her eyes darting to the corners, looking for anyone who might be watching her. She felt a sense of paranoia creeping over her. Was she being watched? Was this some kind of trap? A figure sat in the far corner, their back to her. She couldn't make out their face, but there was something about the posture that seemed familiar. It was almost as if they were waiting for her. As Sarah walked closer, the figure turned slightly, and she saw the person's face for the first time. It wasn't anyone she recognized. A woman, maybe in her mid-30s, with sharp features and a calculating gaze. Her dark eyes seemed to study Sarah as she approached. Sarah, the woman said softly, her voice almost too calm for the situation. I'm glad you came. Sarah hesitated before sitting down across from her. Who are you? The woman smiled faintly but didn't answer immediately. She took a sip from her coffee, watching Sarah carefully. You don't need to know my name. What's important is that I have the answers you've been searching for. Sarah leaned in, her heart racing. What do you know about Mike? About Rachel? The woman's smile faded, and she set down her cup. I know everything, Sarah. I know about the affair. I know why Rachel confessed her feelings for Mike. And I know what Mike is hiding from you. Sarah's head spun. What do you mean, what Mike is hiding. What is he hiding from me? The woman leaned forward now, her voice dropping to a whisper. It's not just Rachel. There's someone else, someone who has been pulling the strings. Someone who's been manipulating Mike, using him for their own purposes. And Mike doesn't even realize it. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Who? Who's been manipulating him? The woman looked around, as if to ensure no one was listening. It's someone from Mike's past. Someone he never told you about. A person who has been quietly controlling his every move, using Rachel as a pawn in their game. Sarah's mind raced. Who is this person? Why is Mike involved? The woman's gaze hardened, and she leaned back in her chair, her expression darkening. I can't tell you everything just yet, Sarah. But I will say this, Mike is not the man you think he is. And Rachel? She's not the only one you should be worried about. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. What had she just heard? Who was this mysterious person, and what did they mean by saying that Mike wasn't who she thought he was? More questions were piling up, and Sarah was no closer to getting answers. As the woman stood to leave, she gave Sarah a final, cryptic warning. Be careful, Sarah. The truth you're looking for might just destroy everything you thought you knew. But if you really want to know what's going on, you'll have to dig deeper. Much deeper. And with that, the woman turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving Sarah alone with more questions than ever before. The cold wind outside slapped Sarah's face as she stepped out of the cafe, her mind racing with the woman's cryptic words. Be careful, Sarah. The truth you're looking for might just destroy everything you thought you knew. What did it all mean? Who was pulling the strings behind Mike and Rachel's relationship? Sarah's fingers gripped the steering wheel of her car as she drove home, the weight of the unknown pressing heavily on her chest. The message was clear. There was more to this situation than she could have ever imagined. It was as though the entire world she had built around her marriage was collapsing, piece by piece. But there was no going back now. The question that lingered in her mind wasn't just about Rachel anymore. It was about Mike. Who was he really? And what was he hiding from her? As Sarah pulled into her driveway, the lights in the house flickered on. She could see Mike inside, moving around, likely preparing for dinner. But even from a distance, Sarah could tell he wasn't the same man she had married. He seemed distant, lost in thought. Sarah parked the car and stepped out, her feet heavy with the burden of the day. She knew this conversation wasn't going to be easy, but it was one that had to happen. It was the only way she would ever get to the bottom of this twisted mess. The confrontation. The door creaked open as Sarah stepped inside. Mike was standing in the kitchen, his back to her, stirring something in a pot on the stove. He didn't turn around when she entered. Mike? Sarah's voice was steady but tinged with an urgency she couldn't suppress. He glanced over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. Hey, you're back early. Everything okay? Sarah's heart skipped a beat. He was trying to act normal, trying to play it off as though nothing had changed. But everything had changed. She couldn't just pretend anymore. She couldn't live in this state of confusion and doubt. Mike, she began, her voice firm now, I need you to tell me the truth. About Rachel. About everything. He froze for a moment, the stirring of the pot slowing down. Then, without turning around, he sighed, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the world had just been placed on them. Sarah, not this again. No, Mike, this has been going on long enough, Sarah pressed, taking a few steps forward. I know there's something you're not telling me. I know you've been lying, and I can't keep pretending I don't see it. Mike turned around then, his face a mask of frustration and guilt. I haven't been lying to you, he said, his voice tight. I've told you everything. Everything? Sarah scoffed, her disbelief rising. What about Rachel? Why has she been so involved in our lives, Mike? Why is she suddenly everywhere? And why do you keep brushing me off when I ask about her? He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He seemed to be struggling, trying to find the right thing to say. Sarah pressed on. I know you've been seeing her. I know it's more than just a neighborly friendship. So don't lie to me anymore, Mike. Just tell me the truth. Mike finally met her gaze, his eyes full of pain. I'm not seeing her, Sarah. I swear. But there's more to this than you know. I didn't want to tell you like this. Sarah's pulse quickened. What do you mean? What's going on, Mike? He sighed deeply, rubbing his hand over his face. You have to understand, Sarah. I never wanted this to happen. Rachel. She's not who you think she is. I thought I was helping her, but I've been caught up in something much bigger than I can handle. What do you mean, helping her? Sarah asked, the suspicion in her voice thickening. Mike's voice dropped to a whisper. I got involved with Rachel because of something she told me, something I couldn't ignore. She's in danger, Sarah. And I've been trying to protect her. Danger? Sarah echoed, feeling her confusion deepen. What kind of danger? Mike's eyes darkened. It's a long story, but I'll tell you everything. I never wanted you to get caught up in this. I thought I could fix it on my own. But I can't anymore. The shocking revelation. Sarah's breath hitched as she took a seat at the kitchen table, her mind racing. Mike was pacing back and forth now, clearly struggling to find the words to explain everything. But Sarah needed answers, she needed the truth, no matter how hard it was to hear. Rachel, she's been involved in something dangerous, Mike began, his voice full of regret. There are people, powerful people, who've been manipulating her. I didn't know what to do when she came to me, but I couldn't turn my back on her. She was desperate, Sarah. She didn't have anyone else to turn to. Sarah was silent, her mind struggling to process what he was saying. Why didn't you tell me this before, Mike? Why didn't you trust me? I didn't want you to get hurt, he said, his voice barely audible. But it's getting worse. I can't protect her on my own anymore. And I can't protect you, either. At that moment, Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Protect her? Protect me? What was Mike talking about? Who were these people, and what were they after? Mike, tell me everything, she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. What's really going on? What do you mean, protect? And why are you so involved in Rachel's life? Mike paused for a moment, his eyes darting away as though he was struggling to find the courage to speak. Then, he looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah saw the raw vulnerability in his eyes. I can't tell you everything, Sarah, he said softly. But I can tell you this, there are people after Rachel. People who would do anything to control her, to use her for their own gain. And I've been trying to keep her safe, but I haven't been doing it alone. Who else is involved? Sarah asked, her mind racing. Mike, I need to know. I have to understand what's going on before it's too late. I've been working with someone I trust, Mike confessed, his voice low. I didn't want to drag you into this, but I've come to realize I can't keep you in the dark anymore. I've been working with someone who's been tracking these people. They're dangerous, Sarah. And they're getting closer. Suddenly, Sarah felt a wave of dread wash over her. Who was Mike working with? What was he involved in? I don't know how much longer we have, Sarah, Mike continued, his voice tinged with urgency. These people, whoever they are, they're going to come after all of us. And I don't know if I can keep you safe. The plan. The air in the kitchen felt heavy, oppressive. Sarah could barely process everything Mike had just told her. She had never imagined that her life, her marriage, could unravel so quickly. There were so many questions, so many layers to this mystery that she couldn't even begin to understand. But one thing was certain, the situation was far worse than she had ever feared. Rachel wasn't just some neighbor with a crush on Mike. She was at the center of something much larger, something dangerous. And Mike, her husband, was in the thick of it, trying to protect her. "We have to leave," Mike said suddenly, breaking the silence. "We can't stay here. It's not safe anymore." "Leave?" Sarah repeated, her voice shaking. "Where are we supposed to go?" "I don't know yet," Mike said. "But we need to get out of town. We need to lay low until we figure out what to do next." As Sarah looked at him, the gravity of the situation settled over her. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear, her life was about to change in ways she couldn't have predicted. There was no turning back now. The truth was out. But the real question was, would Sarah be able to survive whatever was coming next? Just as Sarah opened her mouth to ask Mike more questions, the phone rang. It was an unknown number. Sarah glanced at Mike, her heart pounding. He looked just as uneasy as she felt. "Answer it," he whispered. Sarah hesitated, but finally picked up the phone. A voice on the other end spoke in a low, familiar tone. "We know you're listening," the voice said. "And we know what Mike's been doing. He's in over his head. And so are you." The line went dead. Sarah's stomach twisted into knots. Who was that? What did they want? As the call ended, she knew one thing for sure, this mystery was far from over. The phone call lingered in Sarah's mind, replaying over and over in her thoughts. "We know what Mike's been doing. He's in over his head. And so are you." The words seemed to echo in her ears, a haunting reminder of the threat she and Mike were facing. She stood in the kitchen, the phone still in her hand, staring blankly at the screen. The line had gone dead, but the message was clear, someone was watching them, tracking every move they made. Her mind raced. Who was this person? And what did they want from Mike? From her? There was no telling how far this web of deception stretched. Mike's involvement with Rachel had opened a door to something darker, something far more dangerous than Sarah had ever anticipated. And now, it was her problem too. Mike had gone silent after the phone call, staring at the wall as if lost in thought. Sarah felt the cold air in the room, the heaviness pressing on her chest as the reality of the situation sank in. "Mike," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper, "who was that?" He turned to her, his face pale, his eyes clouded with guilt. "I don't know. But I've been trying to protect you, Sarah. And now, it seems like I've only made things worse." Sarah's heart raced. There was something in Mike's eyes that she hadn't seen before. Fear. A fear so raw it almost felt contagious. "What are we going to do, Mike? We can't just let this continue." "I don't know," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I've been working with someone to get to the bottom of this, but it's bigger than we thought. We've been tangled in something dangerous, and now it's too late to walk away." Sarah could feel the ground shifting beneath her, her world spinning out of control. "So, what now? What's the plan?" Mike took a deep breath, his eyes locking with hers. "We need to leave. We need to disappear, Sarah. I've made a lot of mistakes, but I won't let them destroy everything. Not without a fight. A decision to make." The weight of his words pressed heavily on Sarah. Leave? Disappear? She didn't know what to think anymore. The life she had built, the trust she had in Mike, was crumbling. There was so much she didn't know, so much that was left hidden in the shadows. But she couldn't deny the fear gnawing at her, the terror of the unknown. Someone had called them. Someone knew too much. And if they knew about Mike's involvement with Rachel, what else did they know? Were they watching every move? Were they waiting for the right moment to strike? Mike, we need to get out of here, Sarah said, her voice firm now, the decision beginning to settle in her chest. We need to go somewhere safe, somewhere no one knows us. Mike nodded, his face pale but resolute. I've been making arrangements. But it won't be easy. We'll have to move fast. And we can't trust anyone, not even Rachel. Rachel? Sarah repeated, her voice sharp. You think Rachel is involved in this? I don't know for sure, Mike replied, his tone heavy with regret. But I've been thinking about it. She's been too involved in everything. Too many coincidences. And I can't ignore the fact that she knows too much. She could be working with them, Sarah. The room fell silent. The thought that Rachel might be part of this twisted game left Sarah feeling cold. Rachel had been so kind, so caring, until now. But what if that was all just an act? What if Rachel had been playing a role, a pawn in a much larger game? We can't let our guard down, Mike added, his voice barely above a whisper. We need to stay one step ahead of whoever is behind this. The words hung in the air like a dark cloud, thick with uncertainty. Sarah knew that things were about to change, dramatically. She had no idea what the future held, but she did know one thing: there was no going back. The choices they made now would shape their lives forever. The escape plan. It wasn't long before Mike and Sarah began packing, moving quickly through the house, gathering essentials for their escape. It felt surreal. The life they had known was slipping away, replaced by a fear and uncertainty that clouded their every thought. Where are we going? Sarah asked, looking up from the suitcase she was packing. Where do we even go? Mike paused for a moment, then looked at her with a sense of determination. I have a contact. A safe house. It's secure. We can lay low for a while and figure things out from there. A contact? Sarah repeated, a mix of skepticism and fear creeping into her voice. Who is this contact, Mike? Can we trust them? Mike's expression hardened. I've known this person for years. They've helped me before. They'll keep us safe. But even as he spoke, Sarah felt a nagging doubt. Could they really trust anyone anymore? What if this contact was just another part of the web, another piece in the puzzle that kept them trapped? We have to hurry, Mike said, grabbing his bag and tossing it toward the door. We can't afford to waste time. The urgency in his voice spurred Sarah into action. She grabbed the rest of their things, stuffing them into bags as quickly as she could. It felt like a nightmare, one she couldn't wake up from. But the reality was clear. They had no choice. They had to leave, even if they didn't know where they were going or what awaited them. They had to take this leap of faith, for their own survival. The drive. The car roared to life as Mike and Sarah drove away from their home, leaving behind the life they had built together. The city lights blurred in the distance as they sped toward the unknown. Sarah sat in silence, her thoughts swirling. Every part of her wanted to ask Mike for more answers, to demand the full truth. But something stopped her. She could see it in his eyes, the weight of guilt, the burden of secrets. She knew he wasn't telling her everything. He couldn't. And maybe it wasn't the time for more questions. For now, all they could do was drive. Drive until they were far enough away, until they were safe. But how far would that be? And how long would they be able to stay one step ahead of the people chasing them? As the miles stretched on, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of loss. She wasn't just leaving behind her home. She was leaving behind everything she thought she knew about Mike. Everything she thought she knew about herself. A new reality. Hours later, they arrived at the safe house, a secluded cabin nestled deep in the woods. It was isolated, hidden from the world. Sarah couldn't help but wonder if this was the beginning of their new life or just another temporary stop in a never-ending game of hide and seek. Mike led her inside, and they began to settle in. There were no luxuries here, just the basics. A small kitchen, a living area with a few chairs, and a bedroom with a bed that looked too small for comfort. But it would do. For now. We're safe here, Mike said, locking the door behind them. We can stay here for a while. But we can't let our guard down. Sarah nodded, her mind still reeling from everything that had happened. It was hard to believe they were really safe. After everything that had come to light, how could she trust anyone? And what about Rachel? Was she really involved in this dangerous game, or was she just another pawn? She sat on the bed, her hands shaking as she tried to piece everything together. But it was like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. The more she thought about it, the more questions she had. And the less she seemed to understand. A call for help. The next morning, Sarah woke to the sound of Mike's phone ringing. It was early, the sun barely rising. Mike answered it quietly, speaking in hushed tones. Sarah couldn't make out the words, but she could tell by the expression on his face that it wasn't good news. He hung up the phone and looked at her, his eyes filled with concern. "That was my contact," he said. "We've been found." "What?" Sarah gasped, her heart sinking in her chest. "How? How could they have found us?" Mike's voice was low, almost apologetic. "I don't know. But we have to leave. Now."